if you're just not hearing dissenting voices, if people aren't speaking up and everybody seems to be agreeing or assuming that everybody's agreeing almost instantaneously, that's a sign right away.
All right, let's kick off today's show. We're talking with Colin M. Fisher, organizational behavior professor and author of The Collective Edge. We're exploring why groups fail despite individual brilliance and how the rising tide of individualism blinds us to our most powerful tools for success. Most groups actually achieve less than the sum of their parts because we've been ignoring the science of collaboration. We're going to learn how to master synergy in groups to accelerate our careers. Colin shares why your best people create dysfunctional teams, how psychological safety actually increases conflict, the real reason meetings waste everyone's time, and why competition inside teams actually guarantees failure. Welcome to the show, Colin. It's great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me, AJ.
I'd love to hear how this project came together.
Yeah, it was kind of a serendipitous story. So there was a scandal over here in the UK with the Boris Johnson's government where one of his ministers left and accused the government of groupthink. And so that was something I taught about. I teach about groups and conformity pressure. And so I wrote a short piece about what is groupthink and what can we do about it. And from that, the guy who became my agent, Max, saw what I had written and said, I think that's a really important thing. Do you think you could write a whole book about that in that same style? And from that, I started thinking about it and I was like, yeah, there are so many books about how we can improve ourselves as individuals. But really, the story of the science of groups and teams is just not out there to the same degree as us trying to understand how we improve ourselves as individuals or how we improve organizations as a whole. So from that, I ended up writing this book.
Well, it's interesting that obviously groupthink in that regard is a scandal. I think many of us think of groupthink as a negative, and you argue that actually there's a lot of benefit to groupthink.
Not so much to the extreme version of groupthink that we think of as this dysfunctional conformity pressure where people aren't speaking up, they're kind of going along with the crowd and just saying what they think everyone else wants them to say. That is dysfunctional. But some conformity pressure is productive and necessary for groups to stay together. That the saying, we need to go along to get along doesn't just come from nowhere. That we do need, sometimes to put aside some of our individual preferences, some of our individual needs for the good of any group that we're trying to stay with, whether it's your family, whether it's your work team, or whether it's a friendship group, that we don't always, get our first preference of everything. And there's always some compromise involved in group life. And conformity pressure kind of keeps us together at times where our individual preferences are threatening to kind of pull us apart a little bit.
Thinking back to my college experience and, much of your young adult life, it is about individual achievement. It's about testing well, getting great grades individually, and then you get to college and there's a lot of group projects. And you start to really now have that conformity, those pressures in groups. And I remember my college experience dreading the group projects, like wanting to be the individual. And I think for many of us in the West, we celebrate individualism to such a degree that we have this blind spot towards groups and their impact. Why do you think that is?
I think there are two reasons. One is that, our psychology is wired for us to understand the world as individuals because we are individuals, right? So we of course are going to relate to individualistic explanations for behavior. It resonates for us that we should, kind of celebrate the achievements of, heroes and ascribe, things are going wrong to these villainous individuals. And that actually fits with a really well-known finding in our psychology that's so basic that we call it the fundamental attribution error, which is our tendency to ascribe causality to the characteristics of individuals rather than situations or groups. So there's, it's no wonder that we think oh, individuals are really what we need to pay attention to here. But then there's a kind of flip side of that, where we really underestimate what groups are bringing and how much they're causing the great things in the world. And that most of the great businesses, the great scientific discoveries, the great bands and musicians, all of this is coming from groups. And there's a lot of science behind the idea that the proportion of group relative to individual discoveries, knowledge creation, businesses has been rising over time. That we're actually in a time now where groups are doing most of the important work. And yet, simultaneously, there's been this rising individualism, not just in the West, but all across the world. And so the kind of our perception of individuals as the vehicle for achievement and the reality that it's actually groups doing this work are really in tension more than they ever have been before. That we're, in a way, the wrongest we've ever been about how things are getting done in the world.
And I think it creates a mental trap for a lot of us with that individualism being so celebrated that oftentimes in group settings, we look to blame others and we look to steal credit, and we don't actually look for the group synergy that creates all this great achievement.
The reason I think group projects and committees and all these things are so dreaded is actually because we've been ignoring groups for so long. We do them really poorly. That for the amount of time we spend in groups, we have not paid attention to the things that make them more effective, that create the likelihood of, as you just said, synergy of these groups being more than the sum of their parts. But it keeps me in business because so many groups are getting this wrong. So many organizations, so many student project teams, everybody could stand to pay a lot more attention to creating the conditions that are most likely to make their group successful. And yet we're just not doing it most of the time.
I think it's only in our modern society how we've been focused on our individual self. When you start to look into philosophy and how different tribes were able to survive through famines and ice ages and everything else, those people did not look at themselves as individuals. They saw themselves as part of a collective, and that collective depended on each other in order to survive those ordeals. The individual is not going to survive an ice age. It takes a tribe, it takes a society, it takes many people coming together and depending on each other to do that, especially, and certainly harsh winters and everything else that goes along in life. You can see through our media how it has been focused on the individual, certainly for some time. And you could see it really taken off during the 60s.
If you kind of trace the trends of individualism versus collectivism, and you're absolutely right that this is our brains evolved for us to be social creatures that live in groups, and that at different times we don't actually view ourselves as this island in the way we do today. That we used to view the self as much more including the close family, and out to kind of these small communities and tribes. And that, but that, by all the indications that we can measure as scientists, we're seeing this rise in individualism that's been creeping up really for about the last 120 years, where we can see it most steeply. And so what I think is the big threat of this is that most of the problems that we have today are things that are going to cross a lot of different boundaries. They're going to require a lot of different kinds of expertise, where we can't rely on, some great hero or savior to swoop in and solve these problems. We're going to need better groups than the ones that we have right now, and that they're going to need to get to work on, being the next great business that's going to change the world, being part of the great governments or the scientific teams that are going to make this discoveries that push things forward.
Let's talk synergy, because I'm hearing the groans in our audience. We've heard this buzzword at work. We need synergy. But what does it actually mean, and how do we create it? Because we've been in those group meetings where there isn't synergy. We dread staring at our calendar with those full of those meetings these days. And I think a lot of us, again, have that negative view of groups because of it.
Synergy is kind of the ideal state of a group, where groups are literally more than the sum of their parts. When you're part of a great band, and this is certainly my early experience. So I used to be a professional musician before I got into this whole business school professor thing. And there were times where you're playing and something is coming out of you that's something you didn't even know was there. And it's something that is truly collective that no one of us could have thought of or predicted or experienced without the group. And that those moments where we really are not just adding up individual contributions, those are the moments of synergy. And that they're actually, in some cases, things that we can measure and we can figure out when groups are actually doing more than the individuals who make them up could have done on their own. But those moments, as you say, are all too rare because most of the things that set us up for synergy are things that we routinely violate. And so meetings are a great example. One of the best things we can do to give ourselves a chance of synergy is to have small groups that are, between 4 and 5, or maybe if we're being generous, between 3 and 7 members. And that it's easy to think about, if we're in a room gathered around a table, or we're at a dinner party, wherever we are, if we've got 4 or 5 people, we can be pretty confident we're going to hear everyone's perspective. Everyone's going to be able to contribute. We're going to know what everyone thinks, and everybody's going to know, basically where everyone stands if we have an hour together, that we're all going to have voice. But meetings often have 10, 20, sometimes more people in them. And that if you think we've got an hour, are we all going to actually be able to contribute? There's almost no way if you've got 20 people in a room and you've got an hour. That's just not going to work. And so a lot of these basic things of how are we going to get synergy, like did we compose the group in a way that even gives it a chance, are violated so routinely. And that we have meetings that are composed based on inertia, based on political concerns, where we're just trying to make people feel involved and give the illusion of contribution without actually thinking carefully about what we want from everybody and why we're there. And that if we don't do these things, if we don't think carefully about the goals that we're giving groups, the tasks that they're asked to do, the composition of that group, and the norms that they are using to communicate, we almost have no chance at synergy. And so, unfortunately, the opposite of synergy, what we call process losses, where groups become less than the sum of their parts, are the norm in most people's experience, because we're not listening to the science and doing these things well.
Well, one of the big parts, especially that our clients talk about in our meetings, is the role of hierarchies in these group meeting settings. Where, yes, that synergy would be great if there were no hierarchy and if everyone's thoughts and feelings were weighed equally. But oftentimes in these group settings, the hierarchy is before we get to the group, and then we're in the group, we defer to others because of that hierarchy, and oftentimes our voice isn't even heard.
Hierarchy tends to get in the way, although it doesn't always have to. And that I would say, on average, most groups and organizations have more hierarchy than they need. And it's pretty easy to understand how that came to pass. That humans, we love status. We love to kind of move up in the social hierarchy and move up rungs in the ladder. But people really, really hate moving down the social hierarchy. That's something that it's so psychologically painful from us. It actually makes us less physically healthy when we feel like our place in the hierarchy is threatened or we might be moving down. And so when people start adding new levels of hierarchy, they almost never take them away in organizations. So all organizations ever do is accumulate hierarchy. And so in most places, we've got too much of it, and that we could stand to have less of it. But then the other part of that is, of what you're saying, is the behavior of those who are at the top of the hierarchy matters a lot. And that they have a lot of control. Whoever's seen as a group leader or seen as powerful and in control of resources can promote you, fire you, or controls your bonus. Those people's opinions matter quite a bit. And that we know in our psychology, negative cues are much stronger than positive cues. So if somebody criticizes you, if they make fun of you, if they, chastise you, that sticks in our minds almost 5 times as strongly as an equivalent positive cue. And so what ends up happening is that we're so afraid of getting these negative cues from powerful people, and that we withhold our true thoughts. And that's really the kind of origins of groupthink, where we get this dysfunctional conformity pressure. We get this group where people aren't comfortable speaking up and saying what they really think. And then, hierarchy can be really dysfunctional. But hopefully leaders can also do some productive things to overcome those.
Well, you bring up a great point about those negative body language signals that we're looking at and reading, and we've seen this in our classrooms where we will film clients. Oftentimes when we're being very analytical and very thoughtful, we can showcase those negative perspectives non-verbally. Scrunch our face, cross our arms, and we may not be judging anyone in the group. We may just be searching for the answer, what to say, but we don't often think about that signal then being read by the group and, to your point, impacting whether people speak up or share and how they're viewed in the group.
When we're kind of uncertain about it in any situation, we look for what's called social proof. We look around to see what other people in the group are doing, and that we take those cues very seriously. And this is, the kind of prehistoric part of our brain that's trying to protect us from getting ostracized from the group, from getting kicked out of our little tribe. But that's not very functional in most workplaces. That what we actually want is, when people are unsure, for them to speak up and for them to ask questions about what they're unsure about. And that, rather than leaders being in a position where their subordinates are guessing what they're thinking, it would be better if they were saying what they were thinking. And I think, there's a higher tolerance for some of this ambiguity or some of these like potentially negative signals in a group that's got what researchers call psychological safety. The shared understanding that it's okay to take interpersonal risks. It's okay to speak up and ask questions, do experiments, sometimes screw stuff up. And that in a group with a lot of psychological safety, you can actually see some of these, potentially critical nonverbal cues or even verbal cues, and saying, hey, I don't think your idea is right. In a psychologically safe group, that could be an okay thing to say. But in a psychologically unsafe group, where we're, the part of our brain that says, oh my God, I might get kicked out here, or, maybe something bad's going to happen, then those same cues have a really outsized effect.
Well, much like synergy, I feel like psychological safety has become a new buzzword. A lot of leaders want to achieve psychological safety for their group, but oftentimes they don't realize that the actions that they're taking actually make it less safe, and we feel more judged in those environments. And some of the best groups have fierce debates and real disagreement to really chew on what's going on and then come up to an opportunity to actually resolve things in a meaningful way. To the outside observer, that might not actually appear psychologically safe, because it might mean heated arguments. It might mean real disagreement. So what are we getting wrong about psychological safety, and what should we be doing to really create that environment, now recognizing how impactful it is?
Yeah, I think you've hit on one of the biggest misunderstandings about psychological safety that certainly I find in my own teaching, which is it's got the word safety in it. So we think, oh, this is going to be this harmonious group that, everybody's, kind of singing Kumbaya around the campfire. And that's what psychological safety is going to look and feel like. But the reality is often quite the opposite, that a psychologically safe group is one where people feel like they can disagree. And they're often the groups that are respectfully combative, that they have vigorous debate between different members. And that psychologically safe groups can look like you've got a bunch of people who are arguing about stuff, and that's good. That's where synergy comes from. That if we all thought exactly the same thing and we knew exactly the same stuff, we had the same perspectives, how are we going to come up with something better as a group than we could have as individuals? That we need that difference of opinion, that difference of information, that difference of skill in order for groups to actually achieve synergy. So to do this, one of the both most obvious and strangely counterintuitive things that leaders can do is simply say that they want people's perspectives. They want people to take these risks. They want people to ask questions when they have them. But then, they have to put their money where their mouth is. And when people do speak up, when they do take these interpersonal risks, knowing that how strongly our brain is cued on these negative cues, especially from leaders, they need to really be cautious about, saying something that could be construed as criticizing the person for speaking up or taking the risk, right? And that's different from saying, like, we can never criticize each other's ideas, but that we don't want to make people feel like it was a mistake to ask that question, or it was a mistake to suggest an idea. That doesn't mean we agree with the idea. That doesn't mean we think this is the right thing for us to be discussing necessarily, but that we have to be really, really cautious about those things. And so leaders have to kind of model this extraordinarily, in a way, risk-seeking behavior, that it's okay to make mistakes. And so talking about your own mistakes is a great way to create psychological safety. Asking what might be construed as an obvious question or a dumb question is a great thing for leaders to do, because it makes it okay for other people to do them, or suggesting an idea that maybe is a little half-baked. Those are great ways for leaders to kind of model this. So saying that you want this, saying that this is an appropriate way to act for this group in this task, and then modeling those behaviors are some of the most important ways that leaders can kind of establish this culture of psychological safety.
I'm glad you mentioned speak up, because I know as an introvert myself, that was another reason that I dreaded groups, because I felt groups reward extroversion to an extreme degree, at least my experience, especially in my early years. And I think a lot of our audience that are on the introverted side, that's one of the reasons they dread the groups, because they can't muster the words. They can't be as loud and as boisterous as often we find in these group scenarios. What can we do to create that supportive environment for those who are introverted and aren't as extroverted, recognizing that leaders tend to be a bit more extroverted in these group environments?
I don't think the things that we do are necessarily all that different. So I'm also, quite introverted as well, that these are not kind of natural behaviors for people at work to, take these interpersonal risks, which is why we call them interpersonal risks. But I think the underscoring of how necessary it is that we get everybody's contributions and perspectives, that we take longer pauses after we ask questions. I mean, I used to teach trainees to count to 7 after they asked a question, and just sit there, be comfortable with some silence, because it may take some people a little bit longer to gather their thoughts and want to contribute and think what they want to say to the group. And sometimes to take time to ask people individually if they aren't contributing in these group settings, if they have any thoughts on what we were talking about, and that that we notice and kind of call out when the balance of contributions in the group isn't quite right. And that I will a lot of times say, hey, I feel like we're hearing from the same people. We're hearing a lot from AJ. We're hearing a lot from Colin. How can we, I want to just check if anybody else has a view on this right now. And that these kind of explicit calling out of what's going on, if we're not hearing from certain people, we're always hearing from the other, maybe it's the more extroverted people, or maybe it's just somebody who's opinionated on that particular issue. But that these patterns are dysfunctional, right? That the groups that make the best decisions, that come up with the best ideas, do tend to have more balanced contributions among members. And the groups that have a really big imbalance where a couple people are dominating discussion and a couple of people are almost never talking, that's not the pattern that you want to see. And so I think intervening quickly when you start to see that pattern emerge, and that, I think, as you say, because we all kind of have different personalities and different leans, this is a very natural pattern to emerge. And so we want to be kind of fighting that from the very beginning.
Yeah, I think recognizing that pattern is so common, especially in leadership, it's important to recognize that the value is really in everyone sharing and speaking out, not just the few most opinionated or loudest voices ruling the room.
I think you've hit it on the head there. We want everybody to contribute, to feel safe to contribute, and that almost, if you kind of got the right structure and the right bones of the group in place, so much of your job as a leader becomes trying to create this environment and these norms where everybody is contributing.
Fact to that is not everyone is a good fit to be in those groups. And certainly when you're in that environment, you're going to find those things out. People will show themselves. So for those folks who may think they're skating through, if you're not contributing, the leaders know who's not doing it. And they're going to start to think, is this person contributing? Is this person a good fit? When on paper, they seem like it, but now it's come action time and they're not producing.
That's why it's important, not for leaders to kind of like just privately note these things and then let it get to a head or let somebody feel like they're skating by for weeks or months, but to, share their observations of what's going well in group dynamics and what's not. And this is kind of what I mean by like, we sort of approach group dynamics like it's something we're not going to talk about explicitly, like we're not going to manage it. Whereas what we should be doing is saying, right from that first meeting saying, hey, I'm noticing that we're hearing a lot from, a couple people and we're not hearing as much from everybody. That's not how I want this to go. So let's see if we can alter those dynamics, almost right away, or to ask somebody, it's like, oh, hey, we haven't heard what you've thought yet. What do you think about this? And that those kinds of interventions are important. And they also show exactly what you're saying, John, that show, hey, I'm noticing what's going on, that I'm aware that these dynamics are happening and I'm attentive to them and I'm going to keep trying to intervene in ways that make them productive. And then if that's not working, then we've definitely got a problem.
Well, yeah, the quiet quitting crew isn't going to like that very much.
No, but I mean, I think, and this is, I think, the part we haven't been talking about as much, that I'm sympathetic to people who are in meetings that don't need to be held, that they're on group, they're being given tasks that are just not good group tasks, or they're not even tasks that have much of a point. So it's like we're writing a report and we don't know who's going to receive that report. We don't know what happens as a result of that report, and we're never going to know. Those are badly designed tasks. That's bad work. And that it's no wonder that people don't give their all when people are not thoughtful about, who's in that room and what work we're being given. And so a lot of times when I do see a group where there's several people who are disengaged, my first thought isn't, oh, there's something wrong with these people. My first thought is, well, have we made the goals clear? Is it clear to everyone why this is important to do? Have we structured this task well? Does this task have the attributes of motivating work, which are usually whole tasks where we have autonomy over how to do it? We see the results of it, and we see its impact on the organization or the world. And that if we don't have that, the problem isn't, trying to put out little fires within your group. The problem is the stuff that's happening before we ever got in the room in the first place, and that the people who aren't doing their job may well be the managers just as much as the subordinates who are seen as disengaged.
Well, that groupthink scandal, and conformity in the group often is due to a aversion to conflict. And conflict, we've talked about, can be good in groups and heated and allow us to get the best out of the groups. But then also that conflict can lead to conformity, groupthink, and the downsides of conformity. So what are the warning signs that this conformity is actually happening and hurting the group?
First, if you're just not hearing dissenting voices, if people aren't speaking up, and everybody seems to be agreeing or assuming that everybody's agreeing almost instantaneously, that's a sign right away. But I think we should take the approach that it's our natural instinct not to rock the boat. That actually disagreeing with the group is hard. And that's not something that anybody's naturally going to want to do. And we're going to have to work to create an environment where that's what's happening consistently. So the assumption should be this is always happening, right? That we're part of a group and that somebody is not speaking up and sharing a dissenting opinion. And it's our job then to try and find that and figure out what it is, figure out if they know something that the rest of us don't know, and make sure that then the rest of us know it to consider what we should do next. And so the warning signs in groups is that consensus emerges really, really fast, that we get there and everybody agrees. We don't talk about what actually people know and what people, what different information and expertise they're bringing. Another sign is that we only talk about opinions. So when we get in a room and we're trying to make a decision, we start with, oh, I prefer A, I prefer B. Well, here's why I prefer A and here's why I prefer B. We really want to approach these things not as these conflictual negotiations between members where we're doing what we call negotiating preferences, where we're trying to, meet in the middle. We want to approach this like it's collective problem solving, like it's us against the problem. And when it's us against the problem, what you see in groups is more sharing of information and perspectives and less talking about here's what I like and here's why you should agree with me. We see more, well, here's the things that I learned from my research. What did you learn? And that in those groups, it's much less likely that we're going to get groupthink because we're not even talking about preferences at the beginning. We're talking about what everybody knows. And that if we get that on the table first, we get all the information out, then the risk is much less that we're going to have groupthink of when we jump straight to talking about what everybody prefers.
And the complete flip side of the coin is just absolute conflict. And you write the escalator to hell. We've been in those situations where the conflict doesn't allow for anything to move forward, and the group itself can obviously be better than the sum of its parts.
Conflict kind of comes in two major flavors. One is task conflict, which is, we have disagreements about what the best way to do something is, what the decision we should make is. That kind of conflict is fine as long as it stays about the task. But once it's me versus you, and it's about, I don't like you, I don't think you're a kind of person who has my best interests at heart, and vice versa, or that we feel like we're competing for a promotion, we're competing for, acclaim and status within the group. That kind of conflict is almost uniformly bad. And that absolutely can prevent us from getting any work done because, even when we're saying things, we don't always believe what the other person's saying. We don't believe that they're sharing everything that they know because they have an interest not in this us versus the problem mentality, but in a me versus you mentality. And so that is always dangerous. And that once it takes hold in a group, it's very difficult to get rid of. And that, on some level, if you're coming to me or clients are coming to you and they're at that stage already, there's been a lot of mismanagement that's likely led us to that point. And that the best advice, of course, is prevention in the case of dysfunctional conflict. And that the first hint that we've got this me versus you mentality in the group, I would take a pause immediately as soon as we have even a light hint that that's happening, where you're anyone says you're the kind of person who anything like that, we've gotten out of the kinds of communication norms and the productive task conflict world, and we've gone over into this dysfunctional relationship conflict. And so you have to be very, very wary, because it's very insidious. Once it takes root, it's very hard to get rid of. And that takes a huge amount of work, almost more work sometimes than just starting over and trying to restart the team. So I would be very careful about getting into that situation.
With that rise of individualism, this idea that competition makes us greater and we look now for competition in everything, it's being brought in groups in unhealthy and toxic ways, as you write.
Yeah. I mean, competition is kind of the great motivator of human beings, right? It's one of the most powerful levers we have to get people really, really, their competitive juices flowing, as we say, that we want to win, we want to get acclaim, we want to, beat other people almost for the sake of doing that. But competition also has some negative side effects that, getting people motivated isn't always the main thing we want to do, especially if it's for individualistic aims. So one thing that competition does is, of course, it makes it harder for us to collaborate. And that once you've had people competing for something, the likelihood that they're going to help each other, the likelihood that they're going to, share all the information and the resources that they have are much less. And that makes it much harder to have productive groups. But the other thing competition does is it has a cognitive narrowing effect on us. So if we're already really, really good at something, competition can help us, perform our best. There's so many instances of, the Olympics where not just one person sets a world record, but several people in the same race set a world record, because, competition does have these kind of promotive effects for people who are already really good at things. But if you haven't already mastered something, competition actually has the opposite effect. So if you're trying to learn a new task, you're trying to do something you haven't done much of, competition's actually going to make you worse at that task. And so, we have to be really, really careful with how we use this. And generally in groups, I don't think there's much place for trying to foster competition inside the group between members. That almost never helps. I mean, there's, obviously you can come up with a couple exceptions, but by and large, I wouldn't advise doing that. If you're going to compete against something, compete against your past self. And it's the same for groups. The groups should be trying to get better than they were before. And we should try to make that explicit and say, here's a benchmark we're trying to beat. And let's be better than we were yesterday. Let's be better than we were last week. But not, let's have, you try and be better than me.
And that competition between groups is healthier than inside of groups.
Again, in an organizational setting, having a rival, having somebody you're working against can, spur better performance. Then in the book, I use the example of college basketball and how UNC and Duke won championships kind of the year after the other one kept winning championships. And this happened a bunch of times. Researchers led by Gavin Kilduff at NYU found that, like, if we actually crunch the numbers and analyze the data, this is true. That when your rival performs well, it makes you perform better the next year. So, I mean, there is something good about that. But that when we kind of get outside, the kind of relatively benign realm of sports, or even, some corporate competition, intergroup competition is probably the most powerful, dangerous force that humanity has at its disposal. That's at the root of every war that we've had, and that even seemingly benign things like, here in the UK, British Airlines and Virgin Atlantic had a famous rivalry. And, it was all fun and games, but then it did lead to corporate sabotage and lawsuits and all kinds of productive things that made both of them worse in the long run, right? They were spending so much time trying to pull the other one down that they weren't sort of doing the thing of both spurring each other to greater heights and setting their own world records in the same race. So it's a very difficult thing to manage. And I think, having a rival can be productive as long as you keep focused on that means we're trying to perform better and better than our past selves, and it's fine if we're also being better than them. It's less fine if our focus goes on let's see if we can pull them down and make them worse as a way of winning. And that's where I think it gets really dangerous.
Yeah, could definitely see the downsides of that, especially inside of a company if you have two teams actively seeking to destroy the other team's chances of winning.
Because it has such clear motivational benefits, a lot of leaders like to foster a sense of competition within their companies. And, that can be okay if we're all doing routine work, if we have, really strong safeguards against this kind of sabotaging other people in the company. But that's really hard to do. That people are really good at finding subtle ways to undermine each other. And no matter how hard you try, if you have a competitive culture in your organization, you're probably going to have some of that. You'd have to be very, very vigilant to kind of keep that healthy. And because of the sort of cognitive thing I was talking about with competition, it makes it harder to have a learning culture when you have a really competitive culture. It makes it harder to have an innovative culture where people are doing things they're not used to doing, where they're trying to have thoughts they're not used to having. And that competition is not great for doing that kind of work.
How should we be thinking about leadership when it comes to groups? Because I think many of us fall into the camp that leadership is that great pursuit of individualism.
We have to be careful to kind of differentiate leadership as the behavior of people who are in formal positions of power, right? We call people who occupy these positions leaders. And leadership as providing a group of people with the direction, the tasks, the resources that they need to get the work done. And if we think of leadership not as just the activities of these individuals in these positions of power, but we think of leadership as a team sport, as something that we can share and that we can all do by trying to help the group have these conditions that are going to lead to synergy. That, whether it's clarifying the role, the goals of the task, whether it's, asking a dumb question that both, helps other people understand what's going on better and creates a culture of psychological safety. Anyone can do those things. And that I think it's much better to think about leadership in groups, not as just the behavior of a formal leader, but as something that's both shared and functional. Shared meaning anyone can do it, whether or not you have a position of formal power, and functional meaning that leadership is the work of giving a group what it needs at that time and achieving whatever function needs doing. And that if we think of leadership that way, it becomes much less individualistic. And it's something that I hope everybody in their groups can take responsibility for.
It creates more of an opportunity to lead from the seat that you're in versus waiting for the hierarchy to emerge to grant you the leadership.
There's a lot of evidence that groups that share leadership perform better. And so if you are somebody who, is seen as the big power holder in your group, there's a lot of benefits to signaling to the group that you want to share that responsibility and accountability, that you would like other people to step up, and that this is something that we collectively own, not just me. But then that has to be backed up by other things in the organization, where if the formal leader is the only one who gets credit or blame at the end and the only one who gets reward, then it just seems like lip service to say, oh yeah, I want us all to take responsibility for managing this group while it's hard, but then if we succeed, I take all the spoils. That's not going to work. So it has to be consonant with the structure, and especially the reward structure of the organization. And that if you're a leader trying to put that in place, it's in your best interest too.
We've covered a lot of ground today. I'd love to know for our audience who are looking to get more out of the groups that we're all in. It seems like 24/7 these days, especially now with virtual work as well, what they can do, what you would recommend they do to really improve group harmony and strive for synergy.
The first thing that I've been talking about is to make sure that your groups are structured well and to really think hard about the goals, the tasks, the social norms, and the composition of your groups, because those dictate so much of what happens after that. And if you really want to know more about that, I hope you read my book and that you can find out more about it on my website at colinmfisher.com.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This is a pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Colin.